Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 118. I'm talking to Alex Nowrasteh. We're going to talk about immigration. This is his level of expertise, this area of expertise with the Cato Institute. And he just recently got chewed out by Congressman Chip Roy about this. If you've seen that video, goes viral. Chip Roy, who is going nuts, who is normally a pretty decent guy, really. I used to live in his district, but I don't anymore, but unfortunately. But yeah, so how are you, Alex?
I'm doing well, Chris. How are you doing?
Okay, Alex. First of all, how did you become passionate about the issue of immigration? And how did you become a libertarian, before we go into details here?
Yeah, so I've been a libertarian since I was a kid.
Yeah.
Both my parents were kind of, Reagan Republicans in California, but they weren't religious. And so I just always liked free markets and didn't care what people did in their personal lives. So as soon as I found out about the word, I was libertarian. With the George Mason University undergrad.
Yeah.
Studied under, Brian Kaplan and Alex Tabarrok and all those good guys.
Oh, yeah.
And then I got interested in immigration. I was interning at a think tank in D.C. I was planning on going to law schools after finishing up working in investment banking. And I thought, this is my last chance to have like a fun time. Might as well intern at a libertarian think tank. And I noticed that there were very few people writing about immigration from a libertarian perspective. This was 2007. So I figured, well, this would be a good niche to fill. And it's never boring because it covers every aspect of social science. And then it turned into a career.
And you can talk to people from all over the world, too. Yeah, Kaplan's a good man. We had him on. I had here a little while ago to talk about the same subject. The one thing that, it's interesting. Your parents were Reagan Republicans, and Ronald Reagan really liked immigrants. You can tell by the way he talks about it. Said, this attitude that anybody can become an American. I wonder what Reagan would think of all this nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, Reagan, said on many occasions that, like libertarianism is the core of conservatism. I think he was too optimistic about that, both back then and definitely today. But, in his farewell, his last address to the nation before he left the White House, he talked about the U.S. being a shining city upon a hill. Anybody can become American. If we have to have walls, they should have wide gates and be open to anybody who has the desire and fortitude to come here. And I think that's there's some other countries in the world like this, but it's such an American, such an optimistic, such a sort of pro-growth mentality that you just don't see in the modern conservative movement at all.
Yeah, I wonder what happened. Do you think it was Pat Buchanan or?
It's hard to see this, right? Like in California, you start seeing the drift in the early 90s. There was a Proposition 187 there where they wanted to cut illegal immigrants off from welfare and kick them out of public schools, even though they were already ineligible for welfare. And they wanted to make sure like every school teacher who thinks a student is an illegal immigrant can turn them into the INS at that time. Yeah. And so I think you start to see the shift there. But you don't really see like a big, and then you see some opposition to Bush, because Bush was pretty good, the second Bush on immigration, and you see some conservative opposition to his efforts to expand legal immigration and to legalize illegal immigrants. But I think the huge turning point really was Donald Trump. He really came on the scene huge in 2015. This was his most distinctive policy issue. Expressed in his particular way with his vernacular. And he really came to dominate and basically convinced almost all Republicans and conservatives to be opposed to immigration.
And it was one of the few issues that he never really flip-flopped on. I mean, he was always consistent about, I don't like immigrants, or I want to build the wall. he was always consistent on that.
Yeah, the immigration and trade, I think, are the two that he was definitely most consistent about. And it was, we're going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. That was his most common phrase about it. But he also supported reducing legal immigration. His platform in 2016 called for cutting legal immigration by 2/3 in the United States. He supported a bill called the RAISE Act, which would have cut legal immigration about in half. And then during COVID, and maybe this isn't like particular to him, maybe any president would have done that, but he cut, legal immigration by over 90% during that year of COVID. So definitely the most anti-legal immigration president this country has had since the 1920s.
You don't think the World Trade Center was much of a factor?
So terrorism definitely slowed down immigration after the 9/11 attacks. There were different rules in place. A lot of immigrant processing was delayed. I do think that does have something to do with it. I think security mindset absolutely does. But like probably the bigger thing in people's minds, like trying to dig into it, is just the perceptions of chaos, right? People see all this chaos along the border. They see the disorder. And whenever people see disorder or chaos, they turn against that thing, even the legal version of it. So I think this would just be a radically different policy debate if there was no illegal immigration along the border.
I guess I bring that up because I definitely think it fueled an exodus from the Libertarian Party.
9/11 did?
Yeah, because you're for open borders. So that was, because that was about when the Libertarian Party's membership peaked. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole that much with the LP, but, but definitely, because, and there was always, this, more immigration derangement syndrome among, the Constitution Party types and those folks. Yeah.
Which is especially ironic amongst the Constitution Party folks, because there is no clause in Article 1, Section 8 that gives Congress the broad authority to restrict immigration for any reason.
Yeah.
They have control over naturalization, but not over immigration. So I always found that particularly amusing.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, they have control. They make rules for how you can become a citizen, but not, but not if you just want to come, if you just want to come across to America to see a football game, and I wonder what, I think what, just makes me realize the evils of this is I've just heard enough, immigration and border horror stories. I even had a situation on my own back in 2000 where I was wondering, are they going to let me into Canada or not? And it's just, she was just asking questions like, well, why don't you have a hotel reservation? I said, well, I'm just going to wing it and stop where I stop and find a hotel. It's just for that. And this was when you didn't even have to have a passport to get into Canada back then. I only had a driver's license, but yeah. So
I mean, border security and those issues are increasingly big issues, not just in the U.S. but around the world. Yeah,
and it also seems to me though that we're getting an industry around immigration. I mean, we have these. I know a guy who went down to Argentina and he overstayed his visa, and I don't know exactly where he got caught or whatever, but maybe he's trying to cross a border or something like that, but he got caught. But basically, he got arrested and he was on a plane the next day. But in America, there seems to be this whole business of we have to have detention centers. And
right.
It's become a business all its own,
There is, but part of that is also due to due process.
Yeah.
So the immigration law is so complicated. It's the second most complicated portion of American law after the income tax. So sometimes figuring out if somebody is an illegal immigrant can be legally complicated. And the courts step in, both immigration courts and then federal courts step in. So part of the reason why there are these detention facilities and people will sometimes wait around for a long time after being apprehended and then going through a court process is because there's some rights and opportunities for individuals to show that they can be lawfully present in the United States, and that's just due to partly the complexity of our law. And I don't know Argentinian or Argentine immigration laws, but I would be surprised if they are as complicated as American laws
Yeah.
in this
Well,
regard.
I'm just pointing out the whole aspect that there are people who are profiteering off of this. There's an industry, with these detention centers, and it's just the same way you hear about prison guards who want to have mandatory minimums. It gives them a job.
It does. I do think mostly in the American context, though, it's policymakers thinking about what policies they think are best, and then you have, an
Yeah.
industry that springs up around it. I mean, immigration attorneys benefit considerably from
Yeah.
this chaos and confusion, but most of them do favor like liberalizing the rules to make it easier.
Well, that's good to know. I've also heard that get some of these scammers to say, okay, give me $5,000 and I'll process I'll help you. I'll help you get your visa. And then it's like 6 months later, they don't even do anything. But 6 months later says, so sorry, couldn't get your visa, that kind of thing. But you're still out the money. I mean, yeah. So
there's a ton of fraud, and that fraud is possible because nobody really understands the laws very well. And there are so many rumors and people are so desperate that a lot of fraudsters and criminals are able to take advantage of people. That's why you have, human smugglers across the border also charging people tens of thousands of dollars. It's because there's no way to come in legally.
Yeah, there's and I suppose they pay a lot of money too. And it sounds like, I am wondering, how is it, what's financing some of these people, say, to get from Venezuela to the Mexican border? It seems like to me it would be difficult enough just to do that. I mean, is it just will, or is somebody funding them, or is there a type of underground railroad or something like that? I mean,
so some of them walk as far as they can on their own. Yeah. Others hire smugglers, and they either pay up front and they pool money from their family or their friends and they pay them back, or they borrow money from the smugglers directly and then they owe the smugglers money after they get to the United States. Some are smuggled also by drug cartels. Drug cartels are already very good at smuggling. So they just diversified also into this area. So sometimes they have to help and carry drugs, etc. Part of the way in the black market. But oftentimes they owe money to the smuggler in exchange for getting them here. And then the higher wages that they earn from being in the United States means that they're, usually able to pay off that fee, but it opens them up all types of problems, of course, in the black market, all types of being held hostage or all types of other types of extortion.
Yeah. Yeah, the only stories I've heard that are worse are North Koreans who get into China.
Yeah.
That they have a really, and what often happens too is that a lot of them end up making their way to Mongolia, and they seem to treat them a lot better in Mongolia. So I noticed I saw a lot of Korean restaurants when I was in Mongolia. So, and apparently if they get deported from Mongolia, they send them to South Korea, which is maybe what they want anyway. But yeah,
that's a much better deal.
Yeah, because But anyway, so where do you think there's any way to? How do you think we turn back this, as I call it, the immigration derangement syndrome?
It's hard. I mean, as I said a little bit earlier, I think the main factor pushing people against immigration is the chaos. But there's this catch-22 where you can't get rid of the chaos without liberalizing, but you can't liberalize without getting rid of the chaos. So it's this real political problem to turn back the clock. I do think it's going to be difficult, but some recent actions by the Biden administration that increase what's called parole, which is the president's power to let in anybody he wants, for some Central and South American countries and Caribbean countries, has reduced the flow of illegal immigrants from those countries specifically to the U.S. border. The overall number is up, but from those countries, for most of them, it's down. So I think that's probably the path forward, is using that power in an expanded way to decrease the numbers to get more operational control over the border. And then once there's been control established for a long period of time, you can convince a lot of folks, policymakers, to expand legal opportunities to come to the United States.
Does it also seem like the people who are screaming loudest for this are people who don't live close to the border at all? Because I was listening to I was listening to the chair of the Libertarian Party of Arizona, and she talks, about how occasionally she's got a minivan and she'll get stopped, by Border Patrol just because she has a minivan and they want to check her car out. But it seems like to me the people who are further away are the ones screaming loudest for this. Is that true? I mean, people who live, people who might live, in Kansas or Nebraska, they're, hundreds, thousands of miles from the Mexican border, but they're screaming about this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the evidence is people who are most concerned about immigration are those who live in areas where there's been like a large percentage increase in immigration over recent years, but usually from very small numbers. So from like, if the immigrant population goes from like 2% to 6% in like a 10-year period, people kind of freak out in those areas. Meanwhile, in areas like, I grew up in Los Angeles, I never really cared about immigration. It was just part of life and it seemed fine. But if I grew up in a place like rural Wisconsin, when it went from 2% to 6% over the last 10 or 20 years, all of a sudden that's a pretty big difference, pretty big change. And those are the people who really like freak out and object. I mean, people on the border, of course, are upset because of the chaos and everything else that's going on. But people who live in cities, people who live around a lot of other immigrants, they're much more pro-immigration than people who live in rural areas without many immigrants.
Yeah, I think that's, and also because you often make the trips and you just realize how difficult it is. And maybe if you've had an experience, because, apparently the Border Patrol can do about whatever they want as long as they're within 100 miles. Is that correct? I mean, and that's a lot of people that impacts if it's within 100 miles.
They do. They have a lot of power of investigations within 100 miles of the border. That includes the sea borders, but it's mostly the land border with Mexico, obviously. A little bit with the border up in Canada. But I think the other thing that people just don't know is how difficult it is to come to the United States legally. So I used to give a lot of speeches to conservative groups in Arizona. And afterwards, after one of them, this lady came up to me and she said, I understand what you mean about the benefits of immigration, but why don't the illegal immigrants just go to the post office and register to become legal? What do they have to hide? And I can understand if that's how you thought the legal system worked, you would be quite dismayed by the large number of illegal immigrants. So I begin every presentation I give now to a group of people with explaining how difficult it is to come to the United States. And there's good research by this late academic, Alberto Alesina, where he took a look at polls where they asked questions like, what's the legal immigrant population in the United States? And the people who guessed like way higher than what it actually is are the people who are the most anti immigration. So the legal immigrant population is about 10% of the population, but these are people who are guessing it's 40 or 50%. And they just think that, oh, well, immigration is terrible. Look at these numbers. But they actually have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to either the complexity of the system or with the numbers of the population.
Yeah, and do they believe you when you show them the numbers, or do they just keep insisting that it's that high? I can't believe anybody thinks that the number of legal immigrants in this country is 40 or 50% of the population.
I mean, people believe all types of nonsense. People are totally innumerate, right? Like, I mean, if I were to ask them what 50% is, I don't even know if they could tell me it's half.
That's true. Yeah. I think, and maybe if people were just more numerical thinkers, it's like, because I'll just like, like I asked my friend Matt, I said, hey, Matt, how much is, I said, how much is gas down there? He says, oh, it's high. I said, okay, how much is gas down there? He said, oh, it's high. And I said, okay, how much is gas down there? And finally he said, oh, it's about $1.19. I said, okay,
Yeah.
That's how I think, but that's not how a lot of people think. It's, I was going to keep asking him until he gave me an actual number,
Yeah, it's always good to drill down on this to try to figure out what people are actually thinking. But I think most of the arguments that people make, like in the media, they talk about economics, unemployment, maybe immigrants take jobs, maybe they use a lot of welfare. I just don't think those arguments really persuade anybody, frankly, one way or the other. I think it's mainly about like security and chaos that really set people off. So if they're worried about terrorism, they're worried about crime, or they think the system's just totally out of control. And when people think things are out of control, they want to clamp down and get that control. And here we are, more chaos.
Do you think we would have all this immigration paranoia if America had laissez-faire capitalism?
So we did, over 100 years ago when we had a more laissez-faire system. So I do think there's something about humans where we are kind of scared of and skeptical of foreigners. I just think that's like part and parcel of us. So I think the arguments would be different, but you see these arguments like in the early in the late 18th century. Even and 19th century about immigrants coming here for welfare, even though the welfare state, was a small fraction of what it is now, and it was all on the city level. So you see those or they're coming here to take our charity was another argument, or they are, because of their ethnicity, just like incapable of assimilating to America. So I think what people will just come up with whatever argument they want to justify the fact that a lot of times they just don't like foreigners. Now, on top of that, you have chaos and the perceptions of chaos, and that all adds to it. But I think at a base level, and this isn't particular to Americans, I think Americans are probably some of the least xenophobic people in the world. But you have this instinct everywhere.
Yeah, that would be shocking if Americans are the least xenophobic people in the world. I mean, well, also, you mentioned, I think really the first time we saw it, I mean, I know there was that Know Nothing party that they called it. And I think that was largely a response to all the Irish immigrants who were leaving Ireland during the potato famine, which was really, and that was also when Catholics became the most dominant religious sect in America.
Well, it's when they
populated. I mean, there were more Catholics than Baptists, or
Yeah, not compared to Protestants overall. But like and a lot of the nativism in the US from the early 19th century up until really like the 1960s was bound up in anti-Catholicism. There are a bunch of quotes from folks a long time ago, even including some founding fathers like John Jay, who wrote about how, Catholics just have a bad culture. They are authoritarians. Their religion teaches them to obey authority, and these characteristics are not suitable to a free commercial republic like the United States. And you saw these arguments up until the 1960s. In large part, I think the anti-Catholicism is a less of a portion of modern nativism than it was, but you still see people like Dan Stein, who is the founder of this group, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which is very anti-immigration, talking about how, all these Catholic immigrants are coming to the United States because there's no room in the Vatican. I mean, he said that not long ago. And that's just, it's just crazy to me. But there was a real anti-Catholic impulse amongst a lot of Americans back in the day.
Oh yeah, there definitely was. I think that probably also led to a lot of the prejudice against Italians, as well. That's one there's a prejudice though that's really went away. I mean, you don't really see much anti-Italian prejudice anymore. It used to be absolutely horrible in this country, the prejudice against Italians.
That's absolutely true. I mean, some like Nick Gillespie told me that he thought Italians and their descendants were fully assimilated in the United States about the time that The Godfather came out. He says, like, once an immigrant group can sort of celebrate the criminal stereotypes that it has, then that's when they're like fully Americanized. But that took, it took a little while. Immigration from Italy really started to pick up in the 1890s and dropped off in the 1920s due to legal changes in the United States. But what's really cool and interesting is if you track the assimilation of Italians over time by their incomes and education compared to other groups in the United States, Mexicans and Hispanics are about on the same trajectory of integration and assimilation. So if you think it turned out fine with Italians, you should be pretty optimistic about Hispanics.
It is, and I don't know, Alex, the other thing too, I don't want to engage in stereotypes, but there's one thing we could say about immigrants. They love to open restaurants.
And thank goodness.
Yeah. And I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how much that, I suspect that helps a lot. Oh, nothing, oh, thank you for bringing us pizza and spaghetti, or thank you for bringing us tacos and burritos, it's like, okay.
Absolutely. I mean, nativists kind of make fun of this when they debate me. Yeah. They're like, oh yeah, food. Yeah. What a big deal. And I'm like, I eat 2 to 3 meals a day. And it's like one of the last senses that goes when you get older is like the taste, sense of taste. So yeah, having like more food that's good is actually quite a benefit. And it's hard to just take the recipe and do it your own. You need somebody who really knows what they're doing. I mean, it's not the biggest benefit, right? But it certainly is something that's nice. Like my Midwestern mother in California growing up cooked enchiladas, and it was good and it was tasty.
Oh yeah. That's definitely a lot of things. I don't know where. Yeah, it's so I didn't realize fair. Yeah, how. So we actually have an anti-immigration think tank or lobbying organization. That's very interesting.
Well, we have more than that. We also have Numbers USA and the Center for Immigration Studies that are all very anti-immigration. And they were all founded and funded in the 70s and 80s by these these like basically population control environmentalists who realize that population growth in the U.S., birth rates are going down. Most of it's going to be caused by immigration. They're very anti-immigration or anti-population, so they wanted to close down legal avenues. And these are the same organizations that are around today. They've changed their tactics. They've changed their messaging. But they've been around for a long time. And I would argue during the Trump years, the Center for Immigration Studies was probably the most successful think tank dollar for dollar in the United States at implementing its desired policies.
It seems like it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, I don't, and as you pointed out, it seems like I don't think, you've pointed out that we've had almost no cases of terrorism coming from immigrants. I mean, we of course had that one incident on one day on September 11th, 2001, but it's really been pretty much not really any big deal.
It's, the annual chance of being murdered in a terrorist attack since 1975 committed by a foreigner is about 1 in 4.3 million per year. It's pretty small. It's above zero. And I do think a legitimate function of government is to try to keep people like that out of the United States. But we need to realize like the risks are really small and totally manageable.
Yeah. And, I think probably, let them in on tourist visas, but if they want if somebody wants a 3-year visa, you might do a background check or something like that and figure out who they are and, see if they've got a criminal record or something like that. But also we've found that, immigration law can be weaponized against people, and for political purposes. I remember reading one guy story where, he was actually going to change planes in England, just change planes, but they found out that he was on the plane and the plane turned around and went back to its destination. Says, we can't let that guy land in England. And he was just going to change planes there, And I've heard it's actually very much a hassle just to change planes in the USA.
Yeah, I haven't heard too much about that, but when I was living in the United Kingdom for graduate school, my girlfriend at the time, who was American, who ended up becoming my wife, she came out to visit me, and they held her up at the airport for a couple hours questioning her because they thought that I was British, and they thought that she was coming over there to get married. And when my wife found out about that, she was like, no, he's American. They're like, all right, you can come in. And she was thinking to herself, like, why would I want to move to the United Kingdom from the United States?
Yeah. Yeah, and some people, and that's the thing, people say, look, if I have this bad of experience when I speak the same language, how do they treat people who don't speak the language? It's if an American's gonna, I felt that same with my Canada experience. I had another case too, where one of my old political allies who's no longer alive, but he had this Canadian girlfriend, and the three of he another political guy, and he was like 19 or something. He's going to go up and visit his Canadian girlfriend, and they would let the two of them in, but they wouldn't let him in. So basically called up the girlfriend, said, come across the border. She came across the border just fine. Then he just got in her car, and then he got into Canada by going in with her. It's like, they didn't even ask him any questions. It's just so weird the way you can kind of game the system and enter and exit countries, but they also ask questions like they ask them, like, do you own a pistol?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very odd system, but I bet you've seen a lot of changes too, like in the libertarian movement on the opinions about immigration over the decades.
It really bothers me. I don't know where, and Alex, my whole attitude toward this is, I don't want to have to crawl under razor wire if I want to get out of this country. So I don't want razor wire keeping people from getting in.
Mm-hmm.
It's as simple as that.
Right.
The Berlin Wall wasn't built to keep people out. It was built to keep people in. And it's very easy, it's very easy to change the locks and just reverse them. Your fortress can become a prison just like that.
That's definitely something to consider. But I was I've noticed like some folks. There's this guy. I forget his name. He's this podcaster who's a libertarian podcaster. Who's well, no, I forget his name. Do you know what I'm talking? I'm sorry.
I don't. I just kind of ignore this stuff. But one thing. What are the worst immigration horror stories you've heard? I've heard of people being detained for like weeks and stuff like that. It's a.
I think the worst ones are probably those people who are asking for asylum, saying they send me back to my home country, I'm going to be killed, and the evidence they present is not good enough for the judges, so they send them back to their home country, and then they're killed, they're executed.
Yeah.
I think those are probably the worst that I've heard. You do have cases of people who are, they're not good people. A lot of them are incarcerated for real crimes in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Illegal immigrants, but then their term is up, their prison sentence is up, but the U.S. doesn't have an agreement to send them back to the other country. They don't have an agreement with that country, so they sort of languish in detention facilities for a longer period of time. There've been some court cases about those in recent years. So in that case, you kind of got to let them out. Even if they're people who should be sent back because they're violent and property offenders.
Yeah, well, that's why I used the example of the guy I used to work with in Argentina. I said, look, they didn't screw around. They just sent him home. I'd rather get sent home immediately than put in some detention center for a month and then get sent home.
Yeah, part of the argument from the U.S. side is it's sort of a deterrence with consequences.
Yeah.
So the idea is to try to disincentivize it, because so many folks historically anyway have been, illegal immigrants have been from Mexico. So the idea is, well, if you send them back across the border like immediately, then they'll just try again like the next day to try to come across. So they try to do this deterrence or enforcement with consequences, and that's the reason why they do it. But the humanitarian aspects of that are quite egregious, of keeping people locked up for periods of time when there's no victim to their unlawful activity of immigrating illegally, and that could all be resolved very easily by just allowing these folks to come into the United States legally to work and live.
Yeah, apparently there's even cases where where you could even have like the states could set up guest worker programs.
We proposed that. It's not legal now, but we have proposed allowing states to establish their own guest worker visa programs, working with the feds to do that, because the feds would have to check them out to make sure they qualify. They're not threats.
Yeah, I think the worst sometimes, a lot of the North Korean women end up in prostitution in China, and they're like, if they get sent back to North Korea, it's over. It's really bad if they after you've escaped North Korea, you definitely don't want to go back. And
Yeah.
I don't hear that much about them. I guess because the border with South Korea is so demilitarized, it's almost impossible to cross. But it's and China's really the only other option they have. But even China's not a very good option. But yeah, so.
Yeah, now the border between North and South Korea is so fortified and militarized.
Yeah.
Very few people make it across the DMZ. There's probably more like American military defectors
Yeah.
who go to North Korea across the DMZ than South Koreans who make it across.
Yeah. How much do you think of this has been caused directly or indirectly by the U.S. just going in and destabilizing these countries? I mean, yeah, destabilizing countries in the Middle East and they end up in Europe. We destabilize countries in South America and they end up coming here. I mean,
some of it, but I think that's probably exaggerated. I mean, I think like more like indirectly through things like the war on drugs, I think does a lot of that. And we force other countries to make drugs illegal. That causes all these criminal problems, etc. So I think that it can definitely explain some of it. But the thing is, like, the wage differences between these countries and the United States is so large that I just don't think that that's the major driving force. So if we had like a libertarian foreign policy for the last 50 years, I don't think it would be that different, frankly, because like, the wage for like a Mexican with a high school degree who's a man coming to the United States, I mean, it's a threefold increase in wages, even accounting for the cost of living differences, right? Like that's just gigantic. And there's no force in the world that's really going to stop that flow, that economic flow, except like very brutal enforcement of immigration laws, which is probably more brutal than what most Americans would be willing to accept.
Well, I think there's always this attitude that it's not going to impact Americans, and I suspect a lot of the Americans who support this stuff are people who probably never go abroad.
I'm not sure about that. I think that's probably part of it. But I do think, a lot of skepticism of immigration is like pretty widespread in the United States, but probably more concentrated amongst people who are less likely to have passports, who are less educated, who don't live in cities or suburbs or places like that. I mean, it's just like very hard to live in a city or a suburb and think immigration is terrible when, so many people around who are working hard, who have their lives, who are your neighbors and your friends and members of your family who start businesses. It's just hard, I think, to think that, the United States would be much better off if these people weren't here. And you look around, you're like, if millions of people weren't here working and living, you think it'd be better? Like, most people just don't think that. But if you live in an area where there's no immigrants, it's probably easier to think that.
Yeah, and sometimes I wonder too, if it just started with me having, me being, and granted, I was in a small town, but one girl in my kindergarten class is the daughter of a Pakistani immigrant who was an eye doctor and was actually one of the richest people in the town. And so, and I think that just makes a difference. Okay, you have these people, but they're just like us in most cases. So. And I suppose is the wage gap even more for the professional classes, like the doctors and the engineers, or is it?
Usually not. Usually it's for like the lower skilled people where the wage gap is the greatest. Americans who are low skilled, I mean, have very high wages compared to the rest of the world. A doctor who comes here can double or triple his income, but somebody or quadruple it. But somebody from like, Guatemala, who's a high school dropout who comes here, I mean, they have like an increase of like 8-fold. I mean, that's just the argument. And the difference, right, is between, not having central heating in your house in Guatemala and not being able to send all your kids to school. And if some of them get sick or you get sick, you may go hungry. versus coming to the United States and you make, 8 times more, and you're not going to be rich by American standards, but you've got central heating. You can take some time off work if you get sick and not starve. And you can send all your kids to school. They don't have to work.
Yeah. I remember you said something during that debate where you read an article from Paul Krugman, and let it be noted, we don't admire Paul Krugman, but he pointed out, that they said, I'm glad we closed the border so we can implement this big welfare state during FDR's years. You said something like that, right? Can you refresh our memories as to what exactly that was?
Yeah, so the argument he was making is that when immigration is open, it's politically very difficult to increase welfare, because the argument is all these people are going to be coming in from other countries to take advantage of American welfare. So as long as the borders are relatively open, it's hard to expand the size and scope of the welfare state. But as soon as you close the borders, you can do that. And that's what you got with both the New Deal and also the Great Society programs in the mid-1960s, Medicare and Medicaid, was that the best political argument against the welfare state was immigration. And by taking immigration off the table, by closing the border, they were able to implement these programs politically, and they were very popular. Meanwhile, like before the border, when the borders were relatively open before and since the late 1960s, the size of government has grown in the United States, but at a much slower rate than it did when immigration was closed off from the mid-1920s to the mid-1960s.
And we have these immigrants from, say, Venezuela or Cuba. They are not socialists.
No,
they're
not
not
at all.
social. They're not socialists at all.
No.
And I do sometimes wonder if, maybe conservatives do nothing, complain about the welfare state, but they do nothing to get rid of it. And sometimes I think they keep the welfare state there just because they want to keep these restrictions, and they can use that as a rationalization for it.
Well, I definitely think a lot of these conservatives dislike. I don't know if they're thinking that far ahead, but they're definitely oppose immigration more than they oppose welfare.
Yeah,
that's definitely true.
And it really worries me. Like I said, I had a guy who was part of he was there for the YF walkout in 1969. Even he was starting to go, and I figured, well, oh gosh, he's talking about immigrants too. It's like, I don't know how we can get out of this, and I don't know if enough goodwill stories. When people were rioting in France, I posted on Twitter a video of that guy from Mali who climbed up the building to rescue that child in France. And I said, by the way, with all the hatred for immigrants coming on, I'll post this video. And after that happened, I think the president of France made him a citizen, and he got a job as a fireman, which if you can climb buildings, that's the perfect job to have. But,
Totally.
I said, I don't know. There's all this. There's a lot of zero sum thinking, and I don't know if. I don't know if I'd want to live in America if it had 1 billion people, but I think we could certainly get by if we had 1 billion people here.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely want to live in America with 1 billion people. I mean, I definitely want to live long enough to see 1 billion Americans. I think it'd be great.
Well, but certainly, I think we can grow enough food. I think we can. I think we can grow enough food. I think we can create enough resources. I think we can work enough in it.
Absolutely. I mean, the zero-sum mindset, I think, is part of our primitive brains from when we evolved in the savannas, where, resources really are kind of fixed, and the new tribe coming in or new people coming in really does diminish the, capacity for consumption for everybody. But thanks to capitalism, thanks to developments in technology spurned by capitalism, we have the ability to increase resources more than the population. And as a result, we have like unimaginable prosperity compared to our ancestors. And I think we'd have a lot more prosperity if more people were here as immigrants too.
And we've also created a place where a lot of these immigrants were able to flourish and create things. I mean, Tesla couldn't have done what he did in Serbia. Einstein couldn't have done what he did in Europe. It creates a system where you get the best people. And I really want to say too, I wish I wish these people around the world would stop shitting on these Russian immigrants, because a lot of them have left Russia because they don't support what's going on there. And it's, I know a lot of great Russians, and I even asked them, I said, do the Russians who stay there want to live under an abusive government? They say, yes, they do. That's why they left. Well, this has been a good topic. I'm glad I could finally get you on here to talk about this. So you said you only had 45 minutes. So you have anything you want to say before we go?
Well, just thanks for having me on. And, studying immigration and working on this topic has been, politically very frustrating for me from a policy perspective, but it is a great, intellectually, it's a fantastic opportunity to study one of the things that truly does help make the United States a wealthy, prosperous, and free country. And I really hope that policymakers don't turn their backs on it more.
I do like to tease some people I know in South America. I say that the Venezuelan immigrants are going to turn all your countries into baseball countries instead of soccer countries, but
that'd be fine with me.
But okay. Well, thank you, Alex. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, check out my novel, Escape from the Village, check out my Substack. I'm Chris Baker, and we're out. Thank you, Alex. Bye-bye.